It was the dead of winter, 1861, and Washington, D.C. lay under a blanket of fog and tension. The young capital, barely more than a sprawling town, seemed peaceful at first glance. Streets were quiet, fireplaces glowed in modest homes, and the faint smoke of chimneys curled into the sky. But beneath this calm, danger loomed. Only a few thousand soldiers stood between the city and forces that could have brought it to ruin. The nation had fractured. Southern states had seceded, and whispers of rebellion traveled faster than any official telegram. Into this fragile world stepped Abraham Lincoln, a man burdened not only with the presidency, but with the weight of a nation on the brink of collapse. Lincoln arrived by train, the wheels clattering along the tracks like a heartbeat, announcing the arrival of a leader who would face threats that extended far beyond the political realm. Soldiers lined the station in small numbers, their eyes wary, knowing that their defenses were thin and their supplies meager. The city's fortifications were incomplete, its militia scattered, and intelligence about enemy movements often slow or contradictory. Every street corner held the potential for chaos. Every messenger could carry news of impending doom. Yet Lincoln moved with a calm, deliberate focus. He knew that fear in a city like this could be contagious, and that panic could weaken not just morale, but the very fabric of the Union he had sworn to preserve.
By nightfall, the chill in the air deepened, and the fog thickened over the Potomac. Candles flickered in the windows of government offices, casting shadows that danced like specters across the walls. Lincoln retreated briefly to his modest quarters, yet even in solitude, the weight of the city pressed upon him. He reviewed reports, conferred with aides, and considered strategies. Every decision had the potential to mean life or death for thousands. Outside, the occasional soldier patrolled the streets, eyes scanning the darkness, aware that any misstep could spell disaster. The tension was not merely military, it was personal. The president himself was a target, a symbol of the Union, and his presence in the city was both a rallying point and a vulnerability. Every footstep on cobblestone streets could carry news of Confederate movements. Every whisper in a dimly lit alley could signal impending danger. Yet Lincoln's calm, measured demeanor provided a counterpoint to the chaos around him. He understood that leadership in such a moment required patience, a steady hand, and the ability to inspire confidence simply by standing firm. As the night deepened, Washington seemed to hold its breath. The fog rolled over the river, muffling sounds and hiding the true extent of the threat. Soldiers huddled around small fires, gripping muskets with frost-bitten fingers, while lanterns flickered in the distance. The city waited, perched on the edge of history, as a man and a fledgling government faced a peril that few would fully understand at the time. Lincoln's first night in the Capitol was a quiet prelude to the storm to come, a night that would test not only his resolve, but the very survival of Washington itself.
By the first days of Lincoln's presidency, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Confederate forces were massing in Virginia, not far from the Capitol, and rumors of a coordinated attack reached the White House with increasing urgency. The magnitude of the threat was staggering. Some reports spoke of 30,000 soldiers moving with precision, enough to overwhelm Washington's fragile defenses in a single strike. Lincoln's aides scrambled to verify information, but the flow of intelligence was slow and often contradictory. Messengers brought word of troop movements, only to later retract it. Maps were incomplete, and officers disagreed on the best defensive strategies. The president listened carefully to each report, weighing probabilities and risks, fully aware that every decision could tip the balance between survival and disaster.
The city itself seemed almost oblivious to the danger. Children played in the streets. Merchants went about their business. and the fog rolling off the Potomac masked the movements of soldiers on both sides. Yet, beneath this veneer of normalcy, tension simmered. Citizens whispered about the rumors they'd heard. Watchmen patrolled nervously. The faint glint of musket barrels in the distance served as a quiet reminder that Washington was vulnerable. Lincoln understood the psychological weight of the situation. Panic could spread faster than bullets. He moved deliberately, meeting with generals and advisors in candlelit rooms, charting troop positions on crude maps, and considering every possible contingency. The capital had to be defended, not just by walls and muskets, but by the calm authority of his leader. As night approached, the fog grew heavier, the streets quieter, and the reality of the approaching threat settled over the city like a shroud. Lincoln paced through the White House corridors, eyes fixed on maps and dispatches, calculating every step. Outside, distant drums and the occasional bugle reminded those on patrol that the enemy was not far. In those hours, the president's resolve became the city's anchor, a steady presence amidst uncertainty and fear, preparing Washington for the storm that loomed just beyond the horizon. The danger Washington faced was no longer just a distant threat. It was personal. Abraham Lincoln, the newly inaugurated president, was a living symbol of the Union, and that symbol made him a target. Every step he took through the streets, every public appearance, carried risk. In the eyes of his enemies, striking at Lincoln could demoralize the city and perhaps change the course of the fledgling war before it even began. Yet Lincoln refused to let fear dictate his movements. He met with city officials, generals, and trusted aides with a calm, measured demeanor that contrasted sharply with the anxious atmosphere surrounding him. Candlelight flickered across maps and documents in the White House, illuminating faces etched with concern. The president listened to reports of enemy movements, weighed conflicting intelligence, and considered the most prudent actions to safeguard the city. Each decision could spell life or death for soldiers and civilians alike. Yet he remained steady, projecting confidence through the quiet authority of his presence. Outside, the city simmered with tension. Watchmen patrolled the streets, lanterns swaying, muskets clutched tightly. Citizens whispered about rumors of approaching Confederate forces, and still Lincoln carried out his duties, understanding that leadership in such a moment was more than issuing orders. It was about embodying calm in the face of chaos. His presence reassured the nervous militia and officers, reminding them that the capital had a leader willing to face danger directly. At times, he walked the corridors alone, reviewing maps and dispatches by flickering candlelight, contemplating contingency plans. Every piece of intelligence, every conversation with his generals was another layer in the careful calculation required to defend the city. Panic could be as deadly as bullets, and Lincoln knew that the city's survival depended on both military strategy and the steady hand of its leader. As night deepened, the sense of personal peril grew. Lincoln was acutely aware that an attack on him could destabilize the city entirely, but instead of succumbing to fear, he embraced the responsibility, letting his resolve anchor Washington. The president's measured presence became the quiet heart of the capital, a steady pulse in a city bracing for conflict. That night, Lincoln's leadership was tested not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of streets, offices, and corridors, where his calm would ultimately help hold the city together against the storm to come. Washington's survival did not rely solely on Lincoln's resolve. It also depended on the men and defenses around him. As reports of the Confederate threat intensified, Union generals scrambled to strengthen the city's weak points. Local militias were called to duty, hastily organized and poorly equipped, yet their presence added layers to the city's defenses. Fortifications were reinforced where possible, and barricades were set along key streets and bridges. Every wall, every trench, Every sentry post became a critical piece of the puzzle in a city hanging by a thread. Lincoln worked closely with military leaders, visiting fortified positions and discussing strategies in candlelit rooms. Maps were spread across tables, showing both the gaps in the city's defenses and the potential routes the enemy could take. Soldiers trained under the harsh winter sky, drills repeated despite the biting cold, while engineers and laborers worked feverishly to build barriers and strengthen weak points. The air was filled with the muffled sounds of hammers, the distant clash of metal, and the low murmur of anxious voices, all part of the city's desperate preparations.
Yet preparation alone was not enough. Coordination was critical. Officers communicated constantly, dispatching orders to outposts and checkpoints across the city. Lincoln's presence served as a stabilizing force, reminding both leaders and troops that despite the odds, Washington had a steady hand guiding them. Plans were drawn, revised, and redrawn, considering every possible scenario, every potential weakness that could be exploited by a determined enemy. As night fell, the city assumed a tense vigilance. Soldiers manned their posts along bridges and streets, watchfires glowing faintly against the dark. The fog rolled in from the Potomac, masking movements, but also hiding the efforts of those defending the city. Lincoln moved quietly among them, offering words of encouragement, inspecting positions, and ensuring that morale remained intact. It was a city under siege, not yet by bullets, but by the looming threat, and every decision made in these hours would help determine whether Washington would survive the night. The night stretched on, tense and quiet, each hour marked by the faint sounds of sentries, the whispers of officers, and the crackle of small fires. Lincoln's leadership, coupled with the efforts of soldiers and citizens, transformed a city on the brink into a bastion of preparedness. Walls could be rebuilt, trenches dug, and soldiers deployed, but it was the careful coordination, discipline, and steady resolve of its defenders, and the guiding hand of the president, that truly held Washington together. By the early hours, though the threat had not yet struck, the city was ready in ways that few could fully appreciate at the time.
The night had settled over Washington with an almost unnatural stillness. The fog thickened, drifting along streets and alleys, muffling footsteps and obscuring distant sounds. For those on guard, every shadow became a potential threat, and every distant sound, whether a falling branch or a horse's hoof, carried a hint of danger. The city was a tension-filled stage, poised for a performance whose outcome remained uncertain. Lincoln remained vigilant, moving quietly from one defensive point to another. He observed the soldiers, ensuring their positions were manned and that morale remained steady. Words of encouragement pass along the corridors and streets, often simple gestures, a nod, or a quiet conversation that conveyed authority without alarm. Each action, however small, reinforced the resolve of those around him, reminding them that their leader remained composed even when the enemy loomed unseen. The defenders, from local militias to seasoned officers, performed their duties with a blend of discipline and nervous energy. Lanterns swayed with the wind, shadows shifted across the walls, and watchfires flickered in the darkness, casting long, dancing forms that seemed almost alive. Soldiers whispered quietly, exchanged glances, and patrolled methodically, their senses sharpened by the knowledge that the enemy could strike at any moment. In the White House, Lincoln pored over the maps and dispatches one last time. Each detail mattered: troop positions, potential routes of approach, weak points that needed reinforcement. He calculated contingencies, weighed risks, and mentally prepared for decisions that could affect thousands of lives. The city's survival rested not on luck, but on strategy, coordination, and the unwavering calm of its leader. Hours passed slowly, the fog thickened further, the streets remained quiet, and the city
held its collective breath. Every hour of vigilance, every careful observation, every small act of leadership by Lincoln and his officers contributed to a fragile yet resilient bulwark. By the early morning, the city had not been struck, but the night had tested Washington and its people, shaping them into a community capable of withstanding threats that might have otherwise shattered morale. It was a night defined not by battle, but by suspense, leadership, and the quiet determination that allowed the capital to endure.
The hours stretched long and quiet. Washington was draped in fog and shadow, every alley and street a canvas for imagined threats. Soldiers huddled in small groups around watchfires, whispering updates and scanning the darkness for any hint of movement. Lanterns flickered, casting long shadows across buildings and barricades, and the faint metallic glint of muskets caught the eye in the intermittent light. Every sound, whether the distant clatter of a horse or the rustle of a branch, made hearts quicken. Lincoln moved among the city's defenses, observing, listening, and calculating. Each interaction, each inspection was a careful exercise in maintaining composure and morale. He spoke quietly with officers, adjusted assignments, and ensured that soldiers understood both their roles and the importance of staying calm. Leadership in this moment was measured not by loud proclamations, but by presence, by the steady, unwavering assurance of the president himself. The fog became thicker as the night deepened, cloaking the city in a shroud that both concealed and unnerved. Outposts along the Potomac and key streets remained alert, eyes scanning for any sign of Confederate activity. Soldiers' breath puffed in the cold air, forming small clouds that drifted into the mist. The city was alive with anticipation, yet held together by discipline and vigilance, each man and woman performing their duty under the watchful eyes of a leader who refused to allow fear to spread. Inside the White House, Lincoln returned periodically to review reports and update plans. Maps were consulted again and again, calculations double-checked, contingencies reconsidered. Every inch of the city was accounted for, every potential weak point reinforced, and every unit briefed. The careful orchestration of manpower, fortifications, and communication reflected the intensity of the night, a night that could have broken the city if not for precision, patience, and resolve. As dawn still felt far away, the city held its collective breath. Washington was untested by battle, yet the invisible trial of tension, anticipation, and leadership had already begun. Lincoln's calm, methodical approach and the efforts of the city's defenders had transformed fear into readiness. The night, for all its uncertainty, had forged a fragile stability, and by enduring it, the capital stood a chance to survive the storm looming beyond the horizon. The first light of dawn crept slowly over Washington, casting a pale glow across streets and rooftops. The fog that had dominated the night began to lift, revealing a city that, though tense and weary, had endured. Soldiers stood at their posts, eyes still sharp, but their movements carried the quiet confidence of those who had survived a night fraught with uncertainty. Lincoln emerged from the White House, surveying the streets and barricades. He had walked the corridors, inspected the fortifications, and spoken with countless officers and soldiers through the long hours of darkness. The city had held. The threat, though massive and imminent, had not yet manifested into direct attack. It was a victory of preparation, vigilance, and leadership rather than of guns and cannons. Reports filtered in from scouts and outposts. No signs of large enemy movements within striking distance. The city's defenders had been ready, disciplined, and alert, guided by a president who understood that calm authority could be as decisive as any weapon. Lincoln's presence had been a stabilizing force, inspiring confidence and preventing panic. The fragile Union, still in its infancy, had been preserved through vigilance and determination. As Washington slowly came to life, citizens emerged from their homes, murmuring about the strange,
tense night they had endured. Merchants began to open shops, children's laughter returned to the streets, and the rhythm of daily life resumed. But the memory of the night remained. The city had been tested by uncertainty and fear, and it had endured. Lincoln's first night in the Capitol, fraught with danger and the looming threat of tens of thousands of enemy troops, became a defining moment. It was not a battle fought with cannon or musket, but with resolve, strategy, and leadership. The president's careful orchestration of defenses, the disciplined vigilance of soldiers, and the steadfast cooperation of citizens had held Washington together. By dawn, the city and its leader had survived the night, proving that sometimes the quiet heroism of preparation can be just as critical as the clamor of war.